First of all, thank you, everyone. Hope you're having a nice time visiting Helsinki. Absolutely beautiful city from what I've seen before. Really nice. Today's talk is coming soon. Actually, the title should probably be arriving now because it's going along well, but you'll understand what I mean in a moment. But before we talk about that, I do want to take just a moment to mention this little pin I have here with the Ukrainian flag colors. And I just want to say a quick thing about that. So far, we've hosted 2 sets of refugees at our home. The first set was a lovely interview presenter. News presenter, she left Ukraine out of fear for her life, but she felt she had to go back, and she's there now doing her job. The second family, though, was particularly interesting. Absolutely wonderful family. They owned a hotel in Ukraine. They have since found out that Russians who are occupying their hotel have filed the paperwork to claim ownership of their hotel, which is a horrifying thing. I won't say anything more. You can draw your own conclusions, think about it as you will, and we'll move on. So I'm with all around the world. A number of you would probably know our consulting firm. We go in and help people build systems, rebuild systems, refactor systems, build test suites. Sometimes we just analyze their processes and help them be more efficient. Mostly it's Perl, but a lot of this is we've done work in Go, we've done work in Lua, C++, React, quite a number of different languages. And currently, allaroundtheworld.fr is our main website. We don't actually do much work on that website because we're more word of mouth. It's our reputation which gets us work. I'm on Fastodon at Ovid, if you're familiar with Mastodon. There's also Blue Sky, but that looks kind of dead. There's the site formerly known as Twitter. I haven't checked the news this morning. I don't know if they still exist. Let us hope. You can email me at ovid@allaroundtheworld.fr if you'd like to. And the last one is my personal email, curtis.poe@gmail.com. Try not to say that in French. .com. You can get to me there if you'd like to also. And as many of you know, I've been doing Perl for about 20 plus years, along with a variety of other languages, as you will see. For this particular talk, most of you, if you've been to my talks before, you know I like to leave a large set of time at the end so people can ask questions because I cover a lot of material. But I do ask, if there's something in my talk that you do not understand, please hold up your hand and let me know, because it means I have failed as a speaker, and it means if you don't understand it, someone else failed to understand it, and I need to explain. If you would like to expand on the material, however, please hold those questions till the end of the talk so I can make sure I have enough time to give the entire talk. And we're going to talk about Corinna. Corinna has long been a dream of mine. This is built on the work of many other people, but basically we wanted native first-class object-oriented programming built directly into the Perl programming language. And we have not had that for a long time. Ever since Perl 5 was released 3 decades ago, we've been waiting for this. We've wanted this. And our native syntax using bless and the @is array is kind of clumsy. And I was waiting for others to do it. And it was simply when it became clear that they were not able to, they had other things they were dealing with in their life, I started the project, but I'm only the leader of the project. There's tons of other people who actually made it successful. But I want to take a little detour first, because I do want to set people's expectations about what's going to happen when they encounter Corinna for the first time. So for myself, I started programming back in the 1980s. Yes, before you were born, Laura. And I started I'm old. I started programming in BASIC. Of course, that's what many people did. It was on what was my first one? It was a CPM PET system. Yeah. Oh, I hear some oohs and ahs in the audience there. Yeah, that was a long time ago. But some of the stuff I was doing was, for the time, computationally intensive. So I taught myself 6809 assembler. I was working on something called a Cocoa 2 computer at that point. That was a few years later. And then I moved on to C. And in my naivety with C, I thought, oh my goodness, C is so wonderful. It has the power of assembler and the ease of use of BASIC. Because I'm a moron. But what was really fascinating about assembler, BASIC at the time had such a paucity of features that transforming BASIC into assembler was almost a straight port. It wasn't that difficult. It did take me a couple of weeks to do, but I was able to do it. Going from Basic and Assembler, the assembler program we had line numbers down the side. Basic, of course, used line numbers. Going to C, I was like, how can you program without line numbers? I mean, that was how sheltered my thinking was, my unfamiliarity with other approaches to programming. For example, there's an approach for programming called the lambda calculus, invented by Alonzo Church back in the 1930s, I think it was. It's very interesting because it's a way of passing functions around and returning functions. And it's Turing complete, but unlike the Turing machine, it's stateless, not stateful. And it's a different way of programming. And in this particular example, we create a bunch of anonymous subroutines, assign them to an array, and we can call, I should have renamed that better. For every index in the array, we can add a number, and that will return, in this case, 7. The index 3, we add 4, it gives us 7. There's a trivial example, not very useful. Here's how it is in Python. Same code. As you can see, Python it's a lot cleaner, it's a lot more succinct. A lot of people would prefer that. It gives the wrong answer. There's a lot of reasons for that, and this is not a knock on Python. Python's got a lot of great stuff in there too. I really like the language. But you can also get the wrong answer in Perl. There's a variety of different ways. Perl has more than one way to give you a wrong answer, which I think is really awesome. So just because things look a little different in other languages, keep in mind that you're working with another language. You've got to work with the strengths of the language and not its weaknesses. For example, I like Prolog. How many of you have ever programmed in Prolog? Okay, a few of you. It's a very fascinating language where you define the data and then how the rules of the data, how the data is related, what the rules are, and then you ask it questions. And instead of telling it how to figure out the answer, it figures out the answer for you. And if you're familiar with Prolog, this is a natural way of how you would reverse a list. You have your base case, you've got an empty list, it will return an empty list, and then you've got a recursive function of basically you take a head off a list and you shove it onto the tail of the other. It's a long story. I won't go into it. If you have just learned Prolog for the first time, once you start wrapping your head around it, this is a natural way of writing it. And one of the things people say is, don't worry about the internals, how it works underneath. Just write it. It's all nice and expressive. Except this is terrible. And you quickly learn that even though this is how a beginning Prolog developer would write Prolog, that's not how you write this. Because that is O(n) squared. It does not scale. This is sometimes called the naive reverse in Prolog. And Prolog, the performance is measured with the unfortunate acronym of LIPS, which is logical inferences per second. And this one is particularly slow, and it's used as a naive benchmark for Prolog programs. Instead, internally, you use something called an accumulator, which I won't go into details, but basically you can wrap that up all nicely so the interface is the same, but instead of being O(n) squared, it's now O(n). So it's linear performance, a lot faster. That's obviously hand-waving. Linear performance doesn't necessarily mean faster. But again, you do have to learn a little bit how it works under the hood. You have to manage your expectations according to the technology you have. And then there's Java. So I programmed Java for a while, and Java is famous for being verbose, amongst other things, and I hated the verbosity. And I thought, it would be nice if a mutator returned the invocant, so I could chain my mutators and get this working a lot faster. And I played around with this example from Swing. It just pops up a little window which says hello world, and that's it. I didn't get a lot of concision in that. I was very disappointed with the fact that I went from that to that. It wasn't really saving me anything. I actually had that working. It was built on top of the Swing framework. I called it Swing Chains because you had chained mutators, because I'm a very clever man, obviously. And it was a stupid idea because I was working against the strengths of the language and not with them. And that's an important thing. We're going to have to remember that when we start programming in Corinna for the first time. You're not going to be thinking in terms of bless and isa. You're going to be thinking in terms of an actual object system and how that works, not the internals. But let's give a Perl example, because we're here to talk about Perl, and I want to give a good Perl example because this one I see in client code all the time. So before try and catch, we used eval in order to trap an error, the block eval, obviously, not the string. And this is problematic. I'm not going to go into all the details. There's many ways you can write eval and get this wrong. Something a little bit more correct, again, I won't go into details, is to use an eval or do syntax where the eval returns a true value. That also has some problems, and how it has problems will depend upon which particular version of Perl you have installed, so that's a really fun game to play. I don't want to play that game, so we use try-tiny. Try-tiny gives you try-catch. And that trailing semicolon bites me every time because I forget about the trailing semicolon and you get all sorts of weird syntax errors if you forget that trailing semicolon. Very annoying, but it works. So we replaced eval or do with that. That's you don't have to worry about reading that. That's the source code of try-catch. That's everything you have to do to get eval or do to basically work correctly. That's a lot of work in there. Try-tiny. You can't return from inside the code blocks. Well, you can't with eval block either. It returns the outer sub, not to the calling point that you're expecting it to. It's clumsy to step into the code blocks if you're using the debugger. It's very slow. It has all sorts of problems. And you might ask, why did we go through that headache? Because it was easier to get the correct behavior. Being correct is more important than being fast. If you're very fast but you're wrong, your software doesn't matter. If you're correct and you're slow, you can work on the performance later. So correctness is what I try to strive for first, and I urge most people to look at that. So try catch, there's the try-tiny syntax. We now have feature compat try. So this is available for versions of Perl 5.14 and above. Note, we don't need that trailing semicolon anymore. Oh, that's very nice. Now, it's a nice, clean try-catch syntax built into the language. And as you know, 5.3.8, this is built into Perl directly. But that result, here is the thing. I keep seeing this all the time because people start doing a naive conversion from the eval or do or from the try-tiny syntax, and they declare the result, they assign to the result inside of the try, and then they return the result at the end. And I'm thinking, start paying attention to your tools and use the tools as the tools are, how they natively work. This is using them how Perl used to work. You can now just return directly from inside of the try, and you get a nice, short, clean subroutine there. It's cleaner, it's easier to understand. I do know there are some shops which have a standard that you have to have a single return at the end of a sub, so that's going to be an exception. But learn to work with your tools, not against them. Keep that in mind. So when you start playing with Corinna, that'll be important. So we're not talking about the verbosity of the language. We're not necessarily talking about the performance. We're focusing on correctness and learning how to use your tool strings and learning what they are. But we're talking about Corinna. And Corinna is going to be different. It's going to warp your mind a little bit the first few times you play with it, even though it's really simple. And the current status of it is, as you know, we're bringing Corinna into the Perl core. It's being worked on actively now. Paul Evans is doing all of the C work, as I believe. I don't think anyone else is. Maybe someone else has. It is the largest change to the Perl language in about 3 decades. That's a big thing to think about. This is a huge change. And so a lot of thanks to Paul Evans for actually doing the C implementation, but I do want to take the time to thank the team. There's a lot of people who have been involved with the design of this. It took several years from my first implementation, which was terrible, to get this thing right. And it was interesting because my first implementation I put out there immediately, or not my implementation, my first spec. I initially was going to just create an implementation, and I was using keyword declare and some other tools, and I was struggling because some of the work with roles wasn't behaving the way I was expected to, and Sawyer came along and saw my work. He at the time was a pumpkin of Perl and said, don't do an implementation, please. What I actually want you to do is focus on a brilliant design. I've got people who can implement it if you can design it. And totally freed my mind. And it allowed me to focus on building something amazing for the language. And I built something that was not amazing. So I think one of the very first comments was Paul Evans looking at it and saying, why aren't you using lexical variables for your fields inside of the object? I had originally considered that. I was afraid people would be concerned that it looks too much like Raku. There's still been some unfortunate tension between Perl and Raku. If you're not familiar with the background, I'm not going to go into it. But he was right. Lexical variables are a much better choice than methods for the fields. They give you, they simplify so many things and also give you a lot of performance benefits. It was Matt Trout who came along and said, look, you need to build a community around this. You need to go on IRC. IRC actually turned out to be a mistake because it's hard to capture the history of IRC. So a lot of the history of our discussions is lost. And that's frustrating. So some of my further open source work I'm now conducting very publicly on GitHub with issues and discussions and wikis, so people can actually see what was discussed, when it was discussed, and I can remember what was talked about. So many people in this have contributed so many wonderful things. I wind up being the public face of Corinna because I'm usually the person talking about it. I started the project. These are the people who actually made it work. So please keep that in mind. This is what Corinna looks like today. So this is a least recently used cache. I won't go into the benefits of it, but they're really simple to implement. MySQL uses this. They're not always appropriate depending upon the distribution of your cache misses, but it's pretty simple, and you can see this is nice and easy to read. There's nothing strange about that. You'll notice down at the bottom in the get method, we call self. Self is automatically injected into your methods. You don't have to specify that in your argument list anymore. So instead of bless in ISA, bless says, well, you got an object. ISA says, here's some extra methods. That's it. That's it. That's all you get in core Perl. You want to manage state? Forget about it. You got to figure that out yourself. You want to have encapsulation? Forget about it. You got to figure that out yourself. Anything extra you want out of a core object system, you have to build manually. This is kind of like the assembly of OO. And if you've ever done assembly, that's not fun. Corinna, on the other hand, is 4 keywords: class, role, method, and field. That's it. And it gives you almost everything you want out of what we're doing today. It gives you the first 80% of what you want, and then the next 20% is going to take another few years to put in there. But it gives you most of what you want. And it gives you so much of the power because of something called the KIM syntax, keyword identifier modifier. I came up with the name, but it was Damian Conway who noticed a problem with our design, that we had some inconsistencies in the design. And he showed how rewording how some of the things work, we can have an extremely consistent syntax across the entire design, and it gave us so much more power and flexibility and reduced it down to just the 4 keywords. So that's the core grammar: keyword, identifier, modifiers, and setup. So for a class, you can see the keyword. If you're colorblind, I apologize. I used red and bold to try and highlight things. So keywords, you can see class and field. Those are the keyword definitions. You can see there's the identifier, which would be the name of the class, the name of the fields. Modifiers, in this case, :param says that field is a parameter to the constructor. And then we've got the setup. In this case, the field cache defaults to hash ordered new. The field max size defaults to 20. Now, because it has the param modifier, what that says in Corinna is you can pass this as a modifier, as a parameter to the constructor. If you do not have the setup for that, it becomes a required parameter. If you do have the setup, it is no longer a required parameter. So the grammar, very nice, very consistent. And currently what we have, there's 7 stages for the MVP going into Perl right now. If you go out to GitHub Ovid/core, you'll see core is spelled C-O-R in this case. You'll see the spec is huge. This isn't my computer, I can't show you. The spec is huge, but it's extremely well detailed. The MVP that's going into the core is much, much smaller than what we designed because the Perl Steering Council said, look, we need to have... Oh, MVP, thank you. Nick's pointing out I need to find MVP, that's minimum viable product. What's the smallest thing we could possibly get in the core? And that's what we thought we designed. Perl Steering Council said, no. So now we have the minimal viable product, the MMVP. And it's just these 7 things. Classes inheritance are done. Field initializer blocks, that's the equals 20 or the equals hash order, those are done. Roles, convenience attributes, there's the param attribute already in there, but that's being worked on. The MOP is something called a meta object protocol. Don't worry about it if you don't know it. Method modifiers, Again, don't worry about that. So you can see we've got a large chunk of that done. And it's going to be interesting because we're going to learn new idioms, and we don't know what they are yet. And it is important that we don't try to push too much into the core. Learn to work with what we have so we can understand, basically shake the tree, see what falls out. And so far, I have been surprised. I've been a little bit embarrassed, actually. Because if you go back to the 7 stages, I said in the first version of this talk that I gave, of those 7 stages, excluding the MOP, number 6, we need the other 6 to really have a functional object system. That was me being pompous and wrong. And specifically, so Chris Prather, how many of you know the game Rogue? Okay, looks like almost half of you. Rogue was released in around 1980. It was a freeware executable at the time. Later it became open source. Very popular game. There are still versions of Rogue being released today. You can hit your favorite app store for Rogue-like games, and you can find tons of them. And originally it was an ASCII thing, and it's fun. It's a lot of fun. It's got all sorts of interesting things about it, which made it fascinating for its time. And Chris Prather is writing a roguelike game using the new Korinna syntax. And he's got a tutorial that he's been working on. And there's several parts to it. He's not gotten to part 7 yet. He's got some other things going on. He's going to come back to it, but it's really amazing watching him walk through there. He's not only teaching you how to build Rogue, he's also exploring the new class syntax and how it works. And so here's a very simple class for melee attack action, which subclasses off of action. The perform action is very simple. You've got your attack roll, defense roll, whatever. It's clean. Idiotically easy to read, all of this. And unlike core Perl, where you're stitching all the bits together, you just write out what you want. And it's very declarative, which is nice. So the things which are built into Korinna are declarative. Obviously, methods are not declarative because you have to express what they are. But the rest of it's very declarative, so you don't have to worry about all the fiddly bits. Stephen Little, he had something called the Event Loop Orchestra. By the way, this is on SlideShare, slideshare.net/Ovid. Look at the latest presentations. You'll find it there if you want all these links. Created something called the Event Loop Orchestra, which is absolutely amazing. I strongly recommend you check that out. But he got really interested in the new version of Korinna. By the way, Stephen Little, it's a lot of his work that I was basing some of the core concepts of Korinna on. So you need to give him a lot of kudos for this. He started playing around with this, and he started creating something called Stella, which is implementing the actor model of concurrency in Korinna. And once again, there's too much code for me to possibly show it all, but it's all nice, it's clean. There's actually implementing a simple concurrent ping pong thing. It was fascinating to me because I said those 6 out of the 7 steps really had to be there to get a decent object-oriented system in place. And Chris and Stephen both showed that I don't know what I'm talking about. They reminded me of going back to the fundamentals of OO, the simplicity of OO. And it just works. And you can build, even now with this experimental thing, you can build rich, complex, object-oriented systems out of it. I was stunned. We're very fortunate that we've managed to pull that off, but I really was stunned by that. But one thing, this is possible. Oh! This is an older version. I mixed up an older version of the talking there. Anyway, this is possibly one of the most important slides here. Principle of parsimony. If you're familiar with science, I have stolen the term. I'm using a different definition. What we're doing, so in science it means something different, but here we're saying we know we've made some mistakes, but we don't know what they are. So what we're doing is we're trying to design a system that for correcting the mistakes, we can extend what we have and don't have to take anything away. For example, some people are asking, why don't you have multiple inheritance in Korinna? Because if it turns out to be a mistake, we can't take that away or else we'll break existing code. If single inheritance turns out to be a mistake, we could add multiple inheritance and we won't break anyone's code. Why can't you inherit from blessed objects with Korinna? I could give an entire talk about why that is a bad idea. But if it turns out to be too much of a limitation, we could possibly add that back in. But we don't do that now because we're saying, okay, you can't do this, we could add it later. But if we allowed you to inherit from non-Korinna objects right now, and that turns out to be a mistake, which I think it very well might be for reasons I won't go into now, we can't walk that back or else we break existing code. So the principle of parsimony for Korinna is try to make it so that we can extend out without breaking stuff. Very simple, very clean, and it's worked out really well. So this, I'm not going to go into this. I thought I had hidden these slides. Oh, I transferred them to your computer. It might be interpreting this differently. I won't go into that right now. So we are skipping all of that. So Perl 5. When Perl 5 was released, it had objects, references, lexicals, and modules. These were 4 key things that Larry Wall introduced to the language. Came out, what, 1994, I believe? Then he introduced the language to make it more scalable. If you ever worked on Perl 4 code, it was hard to build large, well-structured systems. But people were doing it. Correction, they were building large systems. Let me walk back the words well-structured on that. So Perl 5 introduced these 4 things to make large, well-structured systems, made it easier to scale the language. We're not talking about in terms of language performance, so that was there. We're talking about developer performance, making it easier to reason about systems. So, actually, before I get there, what have we released since 1994 to make the language more scalable? Signatures. That's it. Signatures, I think, are actually more important than Korinna in this respect because that can touch everything. Aside from signatures, there is nothing I can think of in 30 years which has addressed this problem. And it's a problem I see client after client. So Korinna is only the first of a number of my efforts to address this problem. So, Perl 7. People are wondering when Perl 7 is going to come out. I don't know. I'm not part of that decision-making process. There has been some mention by Perl Steering Council and others that Korinna will be part of Perl 7. There might be more, but we don't know what that is. But I'm not thinking about Perl 7 right now. I'm not done with Korinna, but Korinna is not what my focus is on. I'm thinking about Perl 8. And Perl 8, I think, is going to be critical. Perl 7 will be wonderful for the marketing we will have. Perl 8, however, is not going to be for the marketing. It's going to be for the language and for the community. And I was thinking about, what sort of things do we actually want? There's a whole grab bag of things that we could possibly want. Concurrency, multi-methods, metaprogramming, blah, 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 all this stuff. And I actually have a private spreadsheet. I can't share the spreadsheet because there are some notes in there. Some of those are from clients who have asked for stuff. Some of those are from people who do not want their name shared. But I've been keeping track of a lot of this stuff. And I've been breaking this down into the developer appeal, the business appeal, how broad of an impact of a thing would be, the complexity of the thing, and I've been creating a scoring system so I can build out all these things, add them to my spreadsheet and track them, and then sort it by score and figure out what's the greatest value we could possibly put in the language to solve these core problems of scalability, making Perl easier and larger and safer to use. And a couple of the things, I won't go into applications right now, though I would like to, but data types. I don't like to use the word type, but think about Perl 5, packages, objects, lexicals, references. It also had this in Perl.-fmy. We had my type var list attributes. We had type planned 30 years ago. We've had 30 years of basically making a promise that we've not kept. That syntax is vaguely used in the fields pragma and some other places, but it's hardly touched. The syntax is also extremely problematic for reasons I won't go into now. But I want to play make-believe for a moment. What could that get us if we had that there? A lot of the code I'm about to show you, some of it could work, some of it cannot work because the syntax of the language doesn't support it. But I just want you to think about possibilities of where we could get to with Perl 8. Can you imagine my int array equals 4, 5, 6 and trying to assign a string and then it blows up? You can, this is so common in so many languages. And you could call it gradual typing or not. There's a lot of stuff which is being skipped over just this very simple example, but wouldn't that be a very nice thing to have? So our cache LRU example. So this is a naive example. I'm not going to go into reasons why, but obviously, you know, code grows over time and we don't have a lot of features in here, but people generally are not using Corinna yet. So here's kind of what that would look like if it was written in core Perl with bless and isa, where you're manually stitching all the bits together. And it's got some problems. So if you pass, the max size of the cache is how many elements it can hold. What if you pass a reference? Well, if the number of keys or items you have in your hash is greater than your max size, well, the reference will then be converted into an integer which represents the address of that reference, and your cache is going to blow up very quickly. That's going to be extremely unfortunate. What if you call set and you get your key and value reversed, and the first thing is a reference and the second one is the key? That's going to silently succeed, and you don't want that. You call get and you pass it a reference, that's going to fail, but for the wrong reasons. It's a frustration, and I hear some people say, I don't need stuff like that in my code. My code works fine. That's great. A lot of code doesn't need it. I have a lot of utility scripts that I write for all sorts of things that don't need types. They don't. But when I'm working with a client, my code talks to their code, and their code talks to my code, and there we're talking about respecting each other's boundaries. And I still remember this one gentleman who was saying, I don't actually need types. I don't need to check the kinds of data that I have. We don't need this built into Perl. And I was curious, and I looked at some of his CPAN code, and he does have a lot of checks in there for verifying, yes, this is an integer. Yes, this is a hash ref. He's actually doing this, and he's saying he doesn't do this. We don't need to do this manually. But there's a lot of technical reasons why this is hard to do, and TypeTiny and others are fantastic tools, but don't quite get us what we want. And the thing is, even though you would never write code like that, you don't know what other people are passing to your code. You don't know what they're going to be doing with the code that you pass back to them, or they might change their interface silently and your code seems to work, but it's failing because you didn't quite meet their expectations anymore. So I want to go back to the cache LRU class and kind of walk through this. We're going to just look at this very hypothetical example. This doesn't actually work at all because you cannot put you can't list these kinds of type annotations. We're not going to say type anymore. We're going to call them dynamic runtime data checks, or checks for short. And you can't put those kind of checks in a signature because that's illegal syntax in Perl. That will blow up very quickly. But let's walk through that. So imagine your constructor. It takes a class cache LRU, which means class LRU has to actually be loaded into memory. If it's not loaded into memory, it'll blow up. And if you take an instance of the object, it will blow up there. It's taking only the class name. And then an unsigned integer for max size. Some people say it should be a positive integer. Ask me afterwards why it's an unsigned integer. It's an interesting thing about OOP. We'll skip the secret cache method, which you can barely see because that's supposed to be private. Max size, we take an instance of a cache LRU object, and it returns an unsigned integer. And then we set, and we have an instance of the cache LRU object. The key must be a string, and the value must be defined. Just hypothetically, obviously, you can set undefined values in a cache. This is just so you can see some of the hypothetical syntax. And it'll return an instance of the object in case you want to chain your mutator, or you can call it a void context if you want to. And then here's get. Obviously, once again, an instance of the object, and then the key must be a string, and you cannot call get in void context because that, obviously, why would you do that? That is almost certainly an error. And so you've got all these annotations, and that sucks. It really does. You're thinking, why do I want to do all that typing? And you don't. So let's just restrict this to the things that you think are probably going to be an issue, because you know they're calling a method, they're probably going to be calling it on the invocant, it's probably okay. So you just put the checks on the things that you think are actually likely to be problematic. Or if you were to do this with Corinna, you would just do it like that. It's very simple, it's very clean. Because part of the reason why it was so verbose the first time was because we have to manually weave everything together with old style, with the legacy object system in Perl. With the Corinna code, It's actually clean and looks very similar to other languages. It is still illegal syntax. Project Ocean. Ocean, she was an Orisha, or a deity of the Nigerian Yoruba people. I said was, is. My apologies for that. She was a river deity, a fertility goddess. She was kind of, in the story, she's represented as a protector or savior of people. And the intent is, if you will pardon me for being a little bit over the top, Ocean will protect your data. That's the intent of this project. Ceci n'est pas un type. Do not say types. Do not say types. The word is just forbidden in the project. We don't want to use that unless it's absolutely unavoidable, because computer scientists have reasonable disagreements about what they want out of a type system, and computer programmers have screaming matches. I don't want those screaming matches anymore. I do not want to hear them. I'm very frustrated. Computer programmers, computer scientists have completely different expectations. So that man on the left is a computer scientist, Damien Conway. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. That man on the right is not a computer scientist. That was me on the coast of France. Had to go to the restroom, nipped into a pub, and found myself inexplicably starring in an adult-themed Terminator film. So we have been working on this for quite some time. In fact, the initial discussion started in December 23rd of last year. I published a gist about what we need out of, types in Perl. I called them that at the time. And then I sent an email to Damien and said, look, I'm not qualified to do this. I can't, because I know my limitations. I knew I could probably design an object system. I thought maybe I could do something with this, but I just didn't feel like I could. And so fairly quickly, actually, fairly quickly, he actually sent me back a response to that, and we went from there. And in order to get something into the Perl core, you send a pre-PPC email. PPC is Perl Proposed Change. You send a pre-PPC email to the P5P list. You summarize your problem. You present your solution. There's a lot of discussion. And the response to that is, this should be a CPAN module. Most of the time, that's what comes out of there. I've had a number of suggestions rejected for very good reasons for this. So we needed a CPAN module. So Damien's first response to me was January 9th, fairly soon after that, a very long gist. A lot of that initial conversation we had was private, and I'm not going to share it because we wanted to be able to just speak freely and just hash through the problems as quickly as we could. And it took us months to get there. And then he wrote data checks. Ignore the syntax for right now. We used attributes because at the time we thought P5P would be so concerned about backwards compatibility that they would object to us hijacking the type syntax documented in Perl.my. So we used attributes. This is also extremely illegal Perl because you can't put attributes in signatures. So Damien's code, it's an unholy mess of filter simple, PPR, variable magic, and tie. And he admits it is terrible. You should not use this in production. It is not on the CPAN, in case anyone's looking right now. It is out on GitHub, and it can be installed. It has, there's a link to it right now. That might be an old link, but it will redirect. It has almost 200,000 tests in the system. So there's a lot. It has 24 built-in checks. There's also a specification for user-defined checks, and also coercions, which are separated out. Maybe they'll never go in there. And this is the current team that is working on Ocean. Like Corinna, I wanted a team in there so we could bring in a diversity of ideas, different people with different thoughts, because I knew I couldn't do this by myself. Damien apologizes. He can no longer continue for personal reasons, but he very much supports the problem. He said he might answer questions if you send him email, but he's not guaranteeing it. So why do we need this? Well, your code's safer, because you don't know if the data that you're getting, if you get a 5 and you're expecting an integer, you don't know if that 5 is actually valid data, but at least you know the structure of the data is correct. The kinds of data you're getting are correct. You want to send me an array ref of hash refs of integer IDs or UUIDs pointing to customer objects, you can specify that very cleanly, very simply, and the data structure you're getting back is exactly what you asked for. And we made a promise to Perl developers 30 years ago. My type $foo. It's been there for a long time. This could be one of the this in fact in my spreadsheet where I keep things scored to figure out which are the most valuable projects, this one is at the top by far. We have done well with it so far. I'm not certain when it's going to go in there. If you're curious, you can go out to GitHub, you can install the data checks module and start playing around with it, seeing what's easy, useful for you. But this syntax that I'm showing right here, that is probably not going to be the final syntax. We just wanted to get something that was working so we could test out the idea, and any feedback would be gratefully accepted. So Korinna is now partially implemented in the Perl core. It is turning out to be much more powerful than I thought it was. Just one quick aside, because it looks like I've got a little bit of time. One question I'm asked all the time, well, we can't inherit from blessed objects. What's the use of Korinna? About the same time that Perl 5 was released, I can't remember the name of the book. There was a book arguing composition over inheritance, one of the most important things in object-oriented programming. It's extremely important. Don't inherit from a blessed object. Use composition. You can say field $foo equals my hash ordered new, or equals hash ordered new, whatever. And then you can delegate the methods off to that. And this gives you much, much finer grained control. You don't accidentally inherit from some method you didn't expect. You don't accidentally override what should have been a private method internally. You don't have to worry about that. You have full control over it. So this isn't breaking anything. You can still inherit from stuff, sort of, but you're using composition, not inheritance. Roles, we don't have those yet. You're going to be using effectively the same strategy. You would declare your fields, don't expose them publicly, have them set up to stuff to the classes you want, and then delegate off appropriately. The problem with that is quite often roles are things that should not be instantiated into classes. So here you'd be making little helper classes as you go along for no good reason, but the solution works. I thought that it wasn't as powerful as it could be, this experimental stuff. Much more powerful than I thought, though. And Chris and Steven just did amazing work there. We are going to have to relearn how we do OO. A lot of people are...
One, two. Yeah, I think it works. Just expand on what you just said, because it's very interesting. Will there be a phase 2 with another set of features for Korinna, or it's done?
Let me come back to that. I'm just about finished here,
right,
and then I'll answer that in just
you.
a moment. So that question was captured on video? Okay, good. So we are going to have to relearn how we do object-oriented programming, because we've been so used to having to fiddle with all the nuts and bolts internally. Now we've got a standard core set of features, and we're going to be getting a lot closer to how OO works in a lot of other languages, but also getting some things that they do not have. Many languages, for example, do not have native roles, which I think is going to be fantastic for us. We might get data checks in the future. I think we're going to get to the point, we've got a few things we have to finalize. I think we actually get to the point where we could actually write a spec fairly soon. Rewrite the spec, because we do have a full spec. It's based on the old syntax. We still have to nail down a few things and then eventually present a PPC or a pre-PPC to P5P and see if they accept it. I'm not guaranteeing it, though, because even though we can get the spec, doesn't mean that the Perl 5 core is going to accept it, but hopefully it can be there. And I think we're in a good spot for that. And that wraps that up. In the very first question, can you repeat your question for me, Herbert?
I wanted to know if there will be another phase of features for Korinna, or is, like, in your view, I think you already answered my second half of the question. Is it already completed? And that would be no.
Okay, yes, there will be another phase for it. As you can see, we have classes inheritance and field initializer blocks done. Convenience attributes, the only one we have in there is the colon param. There's going to be others, which I'm not going to go into right now, but we do have quite a number of other things which have to go in there. For the MOP, actually, Stephen Little sent Paul and myself an email. So I'm not repeating something, private conversation for someone else. It was also to me. He has a lot of that actually implemented in something called Class MOP, and it works fairly well with Corinna right now, but there are some excess bits which are needed for accessing some of the metadata. For those who are not familiar with this, if you know object-oriented programming, you know that a class is an instance generator. It's kind of like a blueprint for how you make more instances of an object. Kind of like the blueprints of a house is not a house. A house would be the instance. A blueprint would be, here's how the house is going to be built, sort of. MOP, the meta object protocol, is kind of like blueprints for the class. So it tells you a lot of information about the class. It's very useful when you want to do a lot more advanced dynamic type stuff, which I won't go into right now. I should give a talk about metaprogramming at some point. And we're going to have method modifiers later. That's going to add some interesting stuff, like there's going to be the colon comma modifier, which will attach to fields and methods. That's effectively class methods and class data. You can fake them right now. So class data, you can use state $foo at the top, and that'll be class data, except it can't be exposed through the meta object protocol, so you lose information if you do that, but it will work. And there's a lot more I could say, but basically there is more we have to get in there. I think roles in the MOP are going to be the most complex bits, though roles probably the most. But if you want to play around with some of the more advanced features, you can go out to the CPAN right now, play with object : pad, and that's been the test bed for a lot of the Corinna ideas. And you can see a lot more about what could possibly be coming in the future. So I hope that covers your question fairly extensively. Yes?
No? Okay. You were talking about type checking and showing two syntaxes, one with this mostly defunct type syntax and the other one with attributes on variables. Mm-hmm. What I was wondering, are you talking about type checking on compile time or on runtime?
This is all runtime. So first of all, the reason we showed two syntaxes is I showed the one that was more familiar at first, which looks similar to, say, C-style languages. There's an option for a postfix version of that, like you would see in Go and other languages. But the attribute syntax is one we actually implemented because we thought that was a little bit safer for P5P. Turns out we may have been overly conservative. But we're doing this entirely at runtime. There are compile time things you can do. So you could say my int $foo equals Bob, and that could blow up. But the reason we're not looking at compile time right now is we basically want to shake the trees and see what falls out. If we pack too much into the MVP, it will be rejected. And for good reason. It will be too complex. There's also the problem that Perl is an extremely late binding language, which means even at runtime, I could say my int foo equals get value, and I can replace at runtime the get value sub every single time that it's called. I can have it replace itself. And we don't know what's going to get returned. So even though get foo might declare itself as returning an int at runtime, I could have it declaring that returns something else potentially, and that would be unfortunate. So there's a lot of tricky bits with an extremely late binding language. Trying to check too many things at compile time becomes problematic, but later on this might be an option.
But talking about the syntax, you want to use this type syntax, which is, I know both implementations quite well, which is mostly just for fields. There's a field thing in Perl which nobody uses. And this is
the field test,
my type variable name.
Don't worry about the syntax. We're having if you want to, you can go out to GitHub, look at the Ocean project, and start discussing what you think could be appropriate for that. We've been asking a lot of questions about that. Most people don't like the attribute syntax.
So it's not decided yet?
That is not decided yet at all.
Okay,
the syntax right now is just being shown as a way of discussing semantics. but it could potentially have impacts later on. There are things called destructuring assignments that Inge's been working on that I'm looking at for, how does our system work with that? And it looks like it would. But there's so many bits in play right now. So the syntax is up in the air.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Oh, thank you. And I hope you folks enjoyed, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.